For this week's Journal Club presentation, I'm going to be discussing um, the landmark article entitled A Prospective Study of Red and Processed Meat Intake in Relation to Cancer Risk, which was published by Cross et al. In 2007. To provide a little background on the paper, it was written by the authors Amanda Cross, Michael Litzman, Mitchell Gale, Albert Hollenbach, Arthur Shatson, and Rashmi Sinha. The majority of the authors that wrote this particular article were a part of the National Institute of Health, which is in a branch of the United States federal government. With the exception of one author who was Albert Hollenbeck, who actually was a representative of the AARP. And that's significant because these two entities kind of collaborated for this particular paper. It is my assumption that the authors from the NIH did the majority of the research, and Albert was kind of like the conduit through which the FFQs, which I'll discuss a little bit later, were distributed to AARP members. So the journal that it was published in was, I'm not sure if it's PLOS Medicine or if it's PLOS. I'm not sure, but I've seen this journal, articles published from this journal frequently. And it's actually one of my favorite journal articles to read because I feel like the articles that I have read from this particular journal seem to be very easy to read, although it publishes legitimate data. It's written in a way that even a layman can understand, which I appreciate. So this particular division is dedicated to medicine, and they publish articles of general interest on biomedical, environmental, social, and political determinants of health. They emphasize work that advances clinical practice, health policy, or pathophysiological understanding to benefit health in a variety of settings. Their scope just seems to be medicine and all that relates to that. So, biological, environmental, social, and political determinants of health, topics that address risk factors or conditions that would increase risk and health quality. Translational medicine that provides substantial novel mechanistic insights into disease processes with implications for clinical care, and any topic that relates to integrity and ethics of research, especially in regards to medicine. The research question for this article was, does red or processed meat intake increase cancer risk in a cohort of 500,000 men and women enrolled in the National Institutes of Health AARP, formerly known as the American Association for Retired Persons. And so when using PICO to analyze the question or determine if it's a good research question. The population, which is the P in PICO, is written in the question, which is 500,000 men and women. The intervention is written in the question. The intervention would be red or processed meat intake. The control, there is no particular control because the nature of the study does not allow for it. And the O, the outcome would be increased cancer risk. So the P and the I and the O are there, but because this is not a controlled trial, there is no control in this particular research article. Um, I always try to do an appraisal of the existing evidence, just to kind of like compare and contrast the similarities and differences of the outcome that the paper I'm reading is compared to others that have kind of done research on similar topics. And I also like to kind of see how many people have cited the article that I am looking at. And that to me, that kind of, I guess, gives me an idea of how well respected the article is. And also, maybe how valid it is as well. And so this one I can say has been highlighted as a landmark study, meaning that it has been it has been used a lot by others. It has stemmed or sparked um, basically the way people approach the topic, which in this case would be red meat and processed meat as it relates to cancer patients or cancer risk. Um, and so, and it also, it kind of like, I guess, basically the population of the people that were used is the number is high. It's really high. And so, for all those reasons, it's considered what we call a landmark study. When I did a Google Scholar search to see how many people or how many other articles, I guess, research articles, peer reviewed research articles, had cited this particular article as a resource or as a reference, I came up with 486 studies, which is a super high amount. It doesn't really say that they cited it for positive reasons, though. It could be that they cited it as a rebuttal or refute the claim. But the fact that it has been cited so many times let me know that at least people are reading it. um, and then when I did a PubMed search of both red meat and cancer risk and processed meat and cancer risk with a publication date within 5 years as the filter, I came back with 11 clinical trials, one case report, 101 reviews, and 4 observational studies. And I didn't have the opportunity to go through all 100 or more articles, but I will say that the ones that I did read through, as far as the abstracts and just reading the outcomes, or the conclusions that these articles came up with, I will say that the majority of them agree that there is a positive correlation between red meat and processed meat and cancer onset. However, there were some that will say that the determination requires more research. In other words, while some people agree that there is a link, other people say that there is more research to directly link those particular types of foods with cancer, and for reasons why I'll discuss later in this presentation. So, for this particular study, the inclusion criteria was that the participants were all AARP members. They were all aged 50 through 71 because the AARP begins at age 50. I'm not sure why the cutoff was 71. That was not indicated in the article. If it was, I missed it. All of the participants were from 6 states in the U.S., which were California, Florida, Louisiana, New Jersey, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. And then they also had participation from 2 metropolitan areas, and that would be Atlanta, Georgia, and Detroit, Michigan. My assumption is that they wanted to make sure that there was a really good amount of different cultures and ethnicities. But that's my assumption. It was not clearly indicated in the paper, but that would be my assumption for including states along with metro areas. Um, Written informed consent had to be granted in order for a person to be included in the study. The exclusion criteria was that death occurred before the return of the baseline questionnaire. So if someone um, filled out the questionnaire, died, and then the questionnaire was returned after the death occurred, then they were excluded. Um, there were a number that fell into that category. Moving out of the 8 study areas before returning the questionnaire, was an exclusion. Questionnaires filled in by someone other than the participant. My assumption is that they just wanted to make sure that the information was as accurate as it could be, which is interesting to me because, in the case of someone having a caretaker, or someone who has a disease like, let's say, Parkinson's or something that could not write, they may need to have someone fill it out for them. And actually, a caretaker may know better than the person who was filling it out. But regardless, that was an exclusion. Current cancer diagnosis was an exclusion. Current end stage renal disease was an exclusion. And then also extremely low or extremely high daily total energy intake was an exclusion. So this study was what we call a prospective cohort study. There was a cohort of about 570 some thousand people to start, and these people were all members of the AARP. After exclusion criteria, which I'll discuss in a later slide, that population was narrowed down to 494,000 people, which included 294,724 men and 199,312 women. So how it worked is the participants were given a food frequency questionnaire, and that questionnaire basically contained 147 foods, and it asked them, how frequently they ate these different types of foods. The foods that were included on there were pretty much every type of food, but they also placed an emphasis on, well, not an emphasis necessarily, but I would say that red meat was included, and processed meat wasn't also included. And they also, at the beginning of the study, they asked for two 24-hour recall diaries as well. So between that, they were able to kind of get a good idea of how often the people in the study ate red meat and processed meat. So some of the foods that were included was beef, pork, lamb, bacon, cold cuts, ham, hamburgers, and then they also included foods that were not red meat or processed meat in and of themselves, but were food mixtures. So things like pizza, which is not red meat in and of itself or processed meat in and of itself, but may contain a processed meat or a red meat, or dishes like lasagna, things of that nature. And so they took these food frequency questionnaires, and they basically put the participants, or put them in groups of based on how much red meat they ate, and how much processed meat they ate. And they called these groups quintiles. And so we'll dive into the results in a future slide. But that's how it worked. And so after they figured out the red meat and processed meat level of intake, they were they got the participants' names and information, and then as people were put into the national databases that screened cancer diagnosis and death, they cross-referenced those people with their food frequency questionnaire. So in other words, if a person indicated that they ate a significant amount of red meat and processed meat, and then they died of prostate cancer, let's say, that information was put into both a cancer diagnosis registry, which the NIH had access to, and it was also put into a death index, which the NIH had access to. So they were able to see when all of their participants either was diagnosed with cancer or died with cancer, or a combination of both. And then they were able to make their determinants, or the conclusions from that information. So this is a part of the study results, and actually this is kind of like a baseline for the participants in the study. So you see the breakdown between men and women, And then, as I mentioned before, the participants were put into what they called quintiles of red meat intake, which was categorized by the amount of red meat a person ate. So, literally the number of grams per 1,000 calories of red meat a person ate on a daily basis. And they did the same thing for processed meats as well. And so, quintile 1 would be the group that ate the least red meat, and quintile 5 would be the people who ate the most. The baseline characteristics, how the results were broken down in the following slides, which you'll see in a moment, were by age, by race, by positive family history of cancer, if a person was currently married or not, the BMI, if they have a smoking history, their education, and their physical activity level, and their dietary intake of fruits and vegetables as it relates to servings per 1,000 calories. So this table combines the results for both men and women as it relates to red meat intake and its correlation with cancer diagnosis of the different types of cancers listed on the left of the screen. They used 95% confidence interval for most of the cancers, and p-values were listed for most of the cancers as well. The only exceptions to those were oral cavity and pharyngeal cancer and the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma cancer, but all others have a p-value listed. Again, it's broken down by quintile, Q1 being the people that ate the least amount of grams per 1,000 calories of red meat, all the way up to Q5, which are the group of people that ate the most amount of grams of red meat per 1,000 calories. And so the types of cancer that were noted as having a statistically significant correlation between itself diagnosis and red meat intake were colorectal cancer, liver cancer, lung cancer, endometrial cancer. I feel like I missed one. I thought there were 5. Let me go back through. Colorectal, liver, pancreatic, lung. Oh yeah, that is 5. Endometrial. So those would be the 5 types of cancers that showed a statistically significant correlation between red meat intake and cancer diagnosis. This table does pretty much the same thing as far as giving the data for cancer risk or correlation diagnosis, but this one goes over the processed meat intake and cancer diagnosis. And so for this one, we have statistically significant results for 5 types of cancer as well. And so for this one, we have colorectal cancer being statistically significant, pancreatic cancer, lung cancer again, which is the same as red meat, myeloma, and cervical cancer. So those are the findings that were statistically significant. So what I was looking forward to seeing was the breakdowns of the different characteristics that I mentioned in slide 7, where they had it by sex, and then had it by education, and had it by all those different baseline characteristics that they laid out I was disappointed to not see tables that kind of gave this same data, but for each of those baseline characteristics. And it almost was like, well, why even mention it? Why even mention that those are baseline characteristics if you weren't going to report the data based on those baseline characteristics? That was interesting. So, all in all, I feel like the strength of the study, number one, and probably the biggest positive that I could say about this study is that it was a very large participant group with over, almost 500,000 people. That really gives you a really good idea of patterns when it comes to anything really. And in this case, the correlation between food intake, intake of red meat or processed meat and cancer risk. Um, of course, we know the larger the data sample, the more reliable the outcome would be in most cases. Um, Another strength is that they had strong and reliable databases. They used the NIH, well, the AARP number one has, a large number of people who are members and are more likely to participate in those studies. And then the NIH also had the cancer database and the death database at their disposal. Both of which are fed into via hospitals, government entities, that type of thing. And so I would say that those are very reliable databases that the NIH had um, use of, and so that was a good strength. Um, the food frequency questionnaire is generally speaking an objective questionnaire. It asks you, do you eat this food, yes or no? How often do you eat this food? That type of thing. There aren't questions about how they feel about certain types of foods or how they're feeling on this day or that day in a food frequency questionnaire. Same thing for a food diary. So, because it's an objective questionnaire and not a subjective questionnaire, then that will hold more weight as far as what the answers are. There are some limitations to the studies as well. Number one is I feel like the confounders were extremely limited. Um, you know, they did do some some ways of eliminating certain type of criteria to make things, I guess, more level. But it's very difficult to make general statements when you don't know certain things. For example, in this case, we only know that people ate fruits or vegetables, and how much they ate and that type of thing. Actually, um, well, I'll talk about that in a sec. But yeah, so we don't know if it was organic fruits or vegetables, if it were canned fruits or vegetables, what the quality of them, was, and are they eating, 5 to 10 servings per day? Are they eating dietary fiber? All of these things have been known to help with, reducing cancer risk. Um, and not eating them is known to contribute to cancer risk. Um, and then do we know like their body fat percentage? We know that the higher the amount of body fat a person has, it puts them in higher risk for certain types of cancers due to higher estrogen levels. And there are a lot of things that I would say are necessary to know besides how much red meat do you eat and how much processed meat that you eat. Um, I feel like there's more that we need to know in order to make really good assumptions based on this research. Also, food frequency questionnaires can be misleading. Sometimes you forget. Sometimes depending on the source, you may, underestimate or overestimate to just gain the approval of whoever's reading it. For example, um, I don't remember the name of the article at the moment, but there was an article that I read when I first took my first nutrition class in undergrad, way back in like 1999. And it said something along the lines of if you ask people if a nutritionist asks people or dietitian asks people how much vegetables they eat, they always overestimate that because they want to, well, not always, I shouldn't say that, but they're more likely to overestimate that because they want to, I guess, please the nutritionist. It's kind of like, I want to feel better about myself. And so I'm going to let them know that I eat, 4 servings of vegetables instead of really, I may only eat one per day. And the same goes for food frequency questionnaires. If a person knows that they're submitting for health purposes, then they may overestimate the amount of what we might, broadly call good foods, and then underestimate what we might broadly call, not so good foods. And so that can be misleading too. So, you can never really tell with those in the 24-hour diary that they turned in. And then it's difficult to apply across other demographics. I mean, one of the drawbacks I felt like to this particular study was that it was only in relation to people that were 50 to 71 years old. I mean, is it just the fact that they're 50 to 71 years old putting them at a higher risk of developing cancer based on the research? Wouldn't it be a better um, assessment of risk if we included younger people? Maybe people in their 20s who are less likely to get cancer anyway, just due to age, and then measured their red meat intake and their processed meat intake. Those are things that kind of went across my mind. And then what I did not list on this slide, but I would have loved to see was the breakdown across those other characteristics that were mentioned. So they did kind of talk about the characteristics here and there. And by characteristics, I mean the other criteria that they kind of use to assess um, correlations between intake and cancer. So things like their age, their race, their positive family history of cancer, whether or not they were married, their BMI, their smoking history. So these are all things that they included as baseline characteristics and parameters, but they did not include the data in tables as they did with just the combining of the men and women in the cohort, and then how their intake correlated with the cancer. I would have liked to see if, just having a family history of cancer would have put them at higher risk, along with the red meat intake. Otherwise, I mean, and as I mentioned, they did say some things about the characteristics here and there within the text of the article. So I can't say that they left it out completely, but they kind of picked and chose what they wanted to talk about within those characteristics. Um, but they did not like disclose all of that data. And I would have loved to see that, especially the ones that put people in the higher quintile for fruit intake and vegetable intake and smoking history and vigorous physical activity. I would have loved to see that data, but it was not included. And it's almost like, well, why even mention it if you weren't going to include it in the data results? So those are the limitations, in my opinion. So just to draw a conclusion for clinical context, to answer the research question, does red or processed meat intake increase cancer risk in men and women? According to this study, yes, it does. However, I would say more research is needed to include and exclude based on nutritional and lifestyle criteria. If we want to make a conclusive assessment and actually use these recommendations in practice, then I think that we need to have a broader, I wouldn't say broader, I would say more refined, I guess, measure of red meat intake and other things that may contribute to cancer risk. Lifestyle and health history, including dietary patterns, fitness patterns, and family history of cancer diagnosis, is important to consider. And then, although it may be difficult, specific diet versus control would be optimal in making a health determination such as this. For example, maybe taking vegans, and then with the exact same, lifestyle patterns, whether they are very physically active and use, natural health products, skin care products and that type of thing. and then comparing them with people who eat just as many vegetables but also include red meat. I think that would be a more optimal way to make a health determination than to just blanketly poll people without taking those other things into consideration.